It begins in the quiet, after the museum doors have been locked and the last footsteps have faded from the marble halls. Here, under the low, controlled light of an archival room, the air itself seems ancient, heavy with the dust of millennia. Before us, resting on a simple felt cradle, is not a golden mask or a king's scepter, but something far more fundamental, a small tablet of baked clay. It is heavier than it looks, dense with the weight of intention. Its surface is a field of tiny wedge-shaped marks, pressed into the damp earth by a reed stylus 4,000 years ago. There is no artistry here, no flourish. This was not a monument. It was a piece of administration, a page from a ledger meant to be filed and eventually forgotten. Yet it has survived, outlasting the temple, the city, and the civilization that created it. The translation is as stark as the object itself. It is a list, an inventory. 16 measures of barley for the temple granary, 8 heads of sheep allocated to the weaver's guild, 2 jars of refined oil, a disbursement to the household of the high priest, and then a final, unambiguous entry, 30 measures of finest flour, delivered to the celestial account of the goddess Inanna. The entry is recorded with the same dispassionate precision as the others. There is no distinction in the scribe's hand, no change in the bureaucratic language. The goddess is simply another recipient, another line item in the meticulous accounting of a city's resources. Her needs are as tangible and quantifiable as the need for wool or grain, a simple transaction in the economic life of Uruk. This is not an anomaly. It is the overwhelming norm. Drawer after drawer in this archive, and in others in London, Paris, and Berlin, reveal the same pattern. Thousands of tablets, a vast and repetitive library of administrative data. The names change with the city and the century. Enlil in Nippur, Enki in Eridu, but their role in the records remains eerily consistent. They are landowners, resource managers, issuers of production quotas. They receive tribute. They approve building plans. They are the ultimate authorities in a cosmic bureaucracy. The records do not depict them as ethereal beings of faith. They depict them as the silent, ever-present directors of a vast terrestrial enterprise. The language is not that of worship, but of management. One must pause here. The silence in this room is not empty. It is filled with the cumulative weight of this perspective. To hold one of these tablets is to hold a worldview utterly alien to our own, where the divine was not a matter of abstract belief, but of logistical reality. The air grows still as we contemplate the mind of the scribe who saw no contradiction in his work. He was not writing poetry. He was not crafting a myth. He was balancing the books. What kind of world operates this way? What kind of relationship between the human and the divine is based on the cold, hard principles of inventory management? The question hangs in the low light, a film of dust settling on its surface. We move from one cabinet to another, from economic records to historical ones. Here lies a different kind of list, a document known as the Sumerian King List. It is a more ambitious record, an attempt by ancient scribes to impose order on the chaos of memory, to create an unbroken chain of command stretching back to the very beginning of kingship. The tablet is a simple, pragmatic chronology of rulers, cities, and the length of their reigns. It is structured like a dynastic spreadsheet, a tool for establishing legitimacy. The scribe's purpose was not to inspire awe, but to document a clean, linear transfer of power from one ruler to the next, from one capital city to another. It is an artifact of statecraft, cold and procedural, and it is here, in this dry accounting of history, that the system breaks. The record begins with a calm, declarative statement. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Then it lists its first king, Alulim, and the length of his reign, 28,800 years. The next king, Alalngar, ruled for 36,000 years. The list continues, naming 8 kings in 5 cities, their combined reigns totaling 241,200 years. The scribe records these figures with the same steady hand he used for the barley shipments. There is no hint of metaphor, no suggestion of symbolism. These are presented as administrative facts, entered into the official record of the state. The document is bisected by a single catastrophic event. A line is drawn in the clay, and the text states simply, "The flood swept over." After that line, the entire operational logic of the world recorded on the tablet changes. Kingship once again descends from heaven, this time to the city of Kish. But the numbers are fractured. The first king after the flood, Jushur, reigns for 1,200 years. The next, for 900. As the list progresses, the reigns shorten further, from centuries to decades, until they settle into a scale that feels recognizably, tragically human. The list does not explain the change. It merely records it as a fundamental shift in the world's operating parameters. A boundary was crossed. We stand between these two sets of records, the economic and the historical, and the silence in the room deepens. On one side, we have a system of cosmic administration where divine entities are the recipients of grain shipments. On the other, we have a historical ledger that documents a period where terrestrial rulers governed for lifetimes that defy biological possibility, a period that ends abruptly with a world-altering catastrophe. These are not myths collected by poets from the whispers of peasants. They are the official, bureaucratic documents of the world's first organized states, written by men whose primary function was the accurate recording of data. The connection between them feels unavoidable, a quiet hum in the space between the display cases. A world managed by beings for whom a millennium might be a single fiscal year, and a world ruled by kings whose lives spanned geological time. These are not two separate stories. They seem to be two different documents from the same incomprehensible firm. The dissonance is the point. The records do not ask for our belief. They simply state the nature of a system that once was, a system whose internal consistency is as chilling as its content is impossible. The question is not whether it happened, but why it was so meticulously, so soberly, written down. The low light of the archive is a tool. It conceals as much as it reveals, forcing the eyes to adjust, to look more closely at the evidence that rests in the shadows. It asks for a different kind of attention, one that is comfortable with ambiguity, and the vast silent spaces that separate one fragment of clay from the next. Not everyone is meant for this kind of quiet. Not everyone has the patience for questions that only deepen with every new discovery. The fact that you have remained here in this silence suggests you sense what the scribes knew, that some truths are not found in the light, but in the careful study of the darkness that surrounds them. We return to the clay, to the precise, dispassionate hand of the scribe. Before us lies a document of a different order, not an inventory of goods, but an inventory of time itself. It is known as the Sumerian King List, and its function was political, a tool of the state meant to establish an unbroken line of legitimacy from the present ruler all the way back to the origin of rule. It is a document of power, intended to be clear, authoritative, and final. Its surface is dense with names and numbers, each one pressed into the clay with the same methodical care as a count of barley. It does not read like a poem or a myth. It reads like an official chronicle, a ledger of dynasties, a sterile and absolute accounting of who held power, where, and for how long. The air in the archive seems to grow colder as we approach it. The document begins not with a flourish of creation, but with a simple, declarative statement of cosmic bureaucracy. After the kingship descended from heaven, the scribe wrote, the kingship was in Eridu. The language is procedural, as if describing the transfer of a title or the relocation of a regional office. Heaven is not a spiritual realm. It is a point of origin for a system of governance. The authority is not earned or conquered. It is dispatched. The scribe records this event with a profound lack of ceremony, as if it were the most ordinary and expected of transactions. This is the baseline, the established fact upon which all subsequent history will be built. The calm of this opening statement is a silence that precedes a storm of impossible data. In Eridu, the list assigns the throne to its first king, a figure named Alulim. Beside his name, the scribe has inscribed the duration of his reign. It is not 10 years, or 50, or even 100. The number is precise, 28,800 years. The entry is made without qualification or explanation. It is recorded as a simple administrative fact, no different from the 30 measures of flour for Inanna. The scribe's stylus moves on to the next entry, the next king, Alalangar, and records his tenure with the same placid objectivity. He ruled for 36,000 years. There is no shift in the cuneiform, no mark of emphasis, no indication that these figures are anything other than standard units of time, correctly entered into the official record. This is not an anomaly confined to a single ruler. It is the defining characteristic of an entire era. The list continues, a procession of names and numbers that defy all biological and historical frameworks. 8 kings are named across 5 different cities that held the kingship before the flood. Their reigns are consistently measured not in human lifespans, but in geological time. One ruled for 21 Suazro years, another for 43,200. The scribe meticulously adds them up, a celestial accountant balancing the books of deep time. The numbers are vast, alien, and yet they are presented with the dry precision of a census report. The cumulative effect is not one of wonder, but of profound cognitive dissonance. We are reading the operational history of a world that functioned on a completely different temporal scale. The total is stated without fanfare. The combined reigns of these 8 pre-Diluvian kings, according to the official state record, amount to 241,200 years. The number sits there on the clay, a silent monument to an order of reality our own history cannot accommodate. It is a figure that should belong to the domain of geology or astronomy, yet it is presented here as a political fact. The scribe's task was not to be believable to a future civilization. His task was to be accurate according to the records and standards of his own time. In his world, this number was not an impossibility. It was simply the correct sum, the final tally for the first chapter of terrestrial management. A pause is necessary here. The hum of the climate control in the archive seems to fade into a deeper silence. We are confronted by the sheer, unadorned fact of the record. To dismiss it as mere myth is to ignore the context and format in which it was written. A bureaucratic document, a list, a tool of statecraft. To accept it is to break the frame of our own understanding of the past. So we remain in the space between, holding the contradiction. The dust motes drift in the low light, each one a tiny, uncounted moment in the vast expanse of time the tablet so calmly delineates. The scribe offers no help. He is long gone. Only his numbers remain, waiting in the quiet. The chronicle then reaches a stark, unyielding boundary. A line is drawn in the clay, a clear demarcation. The scribe writes a single, terse phrase that changes everything that follows. The flood swept over. It is not presented as a moral drama or a divine punishment detailed with epic poetry. It is recorded as a terminal event, an interruption in the historical record, a catastrophic reset of the entire system. In the cold language of the king list, the Great Flood is an administrative boundary, the end of one fiscal era and the beginning of another. The world before this line operated under one set of rules. The world after it would operate under another. After the line, the narrative of the list resumes with the same procedural calm. After the flood swept over, the text continues, and the kingship had descended from heaven. The kingship was in Kish. The system reboots. The process begins again. but the data has been irrevocably altered. The first king to rule from Kish, a man named Jushur, is assigned a reign of 1,200 years. The next reigns for 900. The numbers are still vast, far beyond the scope of a single human life as we know it, but they are fractured, diminished. A fundamental parameter of the world has been broken. The scale of time itself has been violently compressed. As the list progresses through the new dynasties of Kish, Uruk, and Ur, a clear and disturbing pattern emerges. The lengths of the reigns continue to decay. They fall from centuries to decades, a relentless downward curve. Gilgamesh, a king whose name echoes in epic poetry, is listed here with a reign of 126 years. Later kings rule for 30 years, then 20, then 12. The numbers shrink until they settle into a range that feels familiar, historical, and tragically human. The king list does not explain this gradual degradation. It simply records the data, charting the slow, inexorable collapse of a previous temporal order into our own. Perhaps this is a moment to simply be still, to note the silence in the room where you are, the specific quality of the light, the time on the clock. The scribes who recorded these impossible numbers did so in their own quiet rooms, under their own light, marking time in a world we can no longer access. They were documenting a system as it was. What is being recorded in this moment of your own stillness? Acknowledge it, perhaps, in the comments below. A small personal mark of presence set against the long and silent count of a history that feels both alien and ancestral. We turn from the ledger of kings to a different kind of administrative document. This tablet contains a portion of the text known as the Atrahasis. While often framed as a creation myth and flood story, its language is far more akin to a series of internal memos from a vast, cosmic organization. It addresses a logistical problem, a crisis in management that arose long after the initial phase of world-building was complete. It is not a story about the moral failings of humanity, but a report on the unintended consequences of their existence. The text is concerned with efficiency, order, and the maintenance of a stable operating environment for the ruling administrators. The central problem, the one that ultimately necessitates the flood, is stated in starkly functional terms. The human population had grown too numerous. Their activity, their very presence, was creating too much noise. The text states that this clamor became unbearable for the chief administrator, the entity known as Enlil. His rest was disturbed. This is not the language of divine wrath at human sin. It is the language of a manager dealing with a systemic stress factor. The workforce, which had been created for a specific purpose, had exceeded its operational parameters and was now disrupting the core functions of the administration. Enlil's reaction is not one of personal anger, but of executive decision-making. The text records his attempts to solve the noise problem through a series of escalating measures, first a plague, then a drought. These are not random punishments. They are systemic culls, attempts to reduce the disruptive variable, the human population, and restore equilibrium to the system. From the perspective of the record, these are logical, if severe, management solutions to a problem of overproduction. When these measures fail to curb the noise, the final solution is proposed: a total reset, a flood to wipe the slate clean. One must pause on that word, noise. In the context of a highly ordered hierarchical system, what does it signify? It is more than just sound. It implies disorder, unpredictability, a loss of control. It suggests a variable that has begun to behave in ways it was not designed to. The explosive growth and chaotic energy of human civilization was not a sign of success to be celebrated. It was a critical failure in the system's design, a bug that threatened the stability of the entire platform. The Atrahasis text is a chillingly detached report on the detection of this bug and the increasingly desperate attempts to patch it. We see here the emergence of distinct functional roles among the administrators. while Enlil acts as the stern enforcer of order, the one determined to eliminate the systemic flaw. Another entity plays a different part. This is Enki, the master engineer, the head of technology. In the creation accounts, it is Enki who designs and implements the human worker. In the flood account, it is Enki who sees the flaw in Enlil's plan for total annihilation and arranges for a small group of humans to survive. His actions are not driven by compassion in a human sense, but perhaps by a desire to preserve his work, to save the project from being completely decommissioned. He is the troubleshooter, working against the directives of the chief executive. This specialization is not unique to this text. It is a consistent pattern across the entire body of Mesopotamian records. Different entities have clearly defined and unchanging responsibilities. Ninurta is consistently associated with boundaries, agriculture, and the enforcement of territorial lines. Inanna's domain includes the management of storehouses and the resources of the city-state. Nanna is linked to the measurement of time and the regulation of celestial cycles. This is not a chaotic pantheon of competing emotional gods. It is a highly organized directorate of specialists, each responsible for a specific department in the terrestrial enterprise. The records from different cities, written centuries apart, reflect the same corporate structure. And the original purpose of this enterprise, the reason for humanity's existence, is stated with a clarity that leaves no room for poetic interpretation. In multiple texts, the reason is given in the same administrative language. Humanity was created to bear the toil of the gods, to take over the physical labor that a lower class of divine beings had grown weary of performing. This was not a gift of life. It was a labor solution. We were designed as a biological machine to excavate canals, build temples, and harvest grain, freeing the Anunnaki to focus on higher-level tasks of management and control. Our creation was a matter of cosmic outsourcing, so we are left with these cold records, laid out under the low light of the archive. We have a king list that documents a sudden and catastrophic compression of time. We have an administrative report that frames a global flood as a noise abatement protocol, and we have a creation charter that defines our species as a workforce, a tool designed for a purpose that it eventually and disruptively outgrew. The documents do not ask for our faith. They do not offer explanations. They are the dispassionate, repetitive, and internally consistent records of a system that once was. The strangeness is not in any single detail, but in the chilling coherence of the whole. The paper trail is cold, and it leads into a past far deeper and more structured than we have been taught to imagine. The work of the researcher begins not with a shovel, but with a question. In the quiet of the study, far from the wind and dust of the excavation site, a single tablet from Uruk is no longer an isolated artifact. It is a data point. The gloved hand of the researcher, moving with a slowness born of reverence, places it beside a high-resolution photograph of another text. The two objects, separated by 1,000 miles and 1,000 years, are brought into conversation under the focused beam of a desk lamp. The air is still. The comparison begins. It is an act of meticulous, patient pattern recognition, a search for echoes in the vast, silent hall of recorded time. The initial strangeness of one record is about to be tested against the records of another world, another river, another pantheon. The second world is that of the Nile. Here, the medium is not the cheap, disposable clay of the administrator, but the eternal stone of the monument. The script is not the efficient wedge of cuneiform, but the intricate sacred art of the hieroglyph. This was a civilization obsessed with permanence, with carving its story so deeply into granite and diorite that it might outlast the stars. Their worldview, their gods, their rituals all seem, on the surface, utterly alien to the bureaucratic plains of Mesopotamia. Where the Sumerian scribe recorded the world on a handheld ledger, the Egyptian priest inscribed it onto the walls of the cosmos itself. The scale of their ambition was different, more grandiose, more focused on the passage of the soul than the distribution of grain. Yet, as the researcher traces the lines of a document known as the Turin King List, a papyrus from a much later time attempting to reconstruct its own deepest past, a familiar structure begins to emerge from the fragmented text. Before the first human pharaoh, Menes, who unified the kingdoms of Upper and Lower Egypt, the list records a long, unbroken lineage of divine and semi-divine rulers. The papyrus speaks of a time when the gods themselves reigned directly upon the earth. It is a period of history that is not human, a prologue to civilization written on a scale that defies our understanding of a lifespan. The language is different, the names have changed, but the foundational premise is eerily the same: a world once under direct, physical administration by non-human entities. The Egyptian historian Manetho, writing in the 3rd century BCE, preserved a similar tradition. He speaks of the reign of gods, followed by the reign of demigods and spirits, which lasted for immense periods of time before the first mortal dynasty. He assigns specific vast numbers to these reigns. Ptah, the creator god, was said to have ruled for 9,000 years, Ra for 1,000. The numbers are smaller than their Sumerian counterparts, perhaps eroded by the passage of more time, but the principle remains intact. History does not begin with humanity. It begins with a handover of power from a previous, impossibly ancient order. The record, whether on clay or stone, insists that our own chapter is not the first in the book. Here, in this quiet space of comparison, the mind must be allowed to settle. To see one such record is to encounter a curiosity. To see two, from civilizations with no discernible contact in their formative eras, is to witness the emergence of a pattern. It suggests a shared memory, a foundational story of the world that somehow survived the birth of entirely separate cultures. Not everyone is equipped for this kind of seeing. It requires a willingness to hold contradictory information without the immediate need for resolution. The fact that you are still here, watching these ancient threads being woven together, suggests you belong to the small group of people who understand that the deepest truths are not shouted, but discovered in the persistent, quiet echoes across millennia. The pattern extends beyond the simple fact of divine kingship. It deepens into the realm of function. In the Mesopotamian records, Enki is the master craftsman, the engineer who brings the arts of civilization to humanity. He is a teacher, a bestower of technology. In the Egyptian records, this role is filled by the figure of Thoth. It is Thoth who is credited with the invention of writing, the measurement of the heavens, the foundations of law, medicine, and magic. He is the divine scribe, the celestial administrator who provides humanity with the operating manual for civilization. He does not ask for worship in exchange for miracles. He provides technical instruction as part of a cosmic project. Again, the parallel is one of structure, not of myth. These are not simply stories of benevolent gods. They are accounts of a specific functional transfer of knowledge. The foundational elements of organized society, agriculture, law, architecture, writing, are consistently described not as human inventions, but as technologies delivered by a specific set of non-human instructors. The records frame civilization not as something that grew organically from the human mind, but as a prepackaged system that was installed and taught. The role of humanity was not to invent, but to learn and to execute the plan that had been laid out for them by the original project managers. The investigation must now take a far greater leap, crossing not just a desert, but an ocean. The researchers' focus shifts to a different set of ruins, swallowed not by sand, but by the relentless green of the jungle. Here, in Mesoamerica, the Mayan civilization carved its own complex history into stone stelae and recorded it in folded books of bark paper. This is a world that should have no connection to the ancient Near East. Its languages, its astronomy, its genetic heritage, all are entirely distinct. Any pattern found here cannot be explained away by trade routes or cultural diffusion. An echo in this place would be something else entirely, something deeper and more unsettling. In the quiet of the lab, a specialist works with digital scans of weathered glyphs, the light of the screen illuminating the intricate symbols. The focus is a text transcribed after the Spanish conquest, a document that saved a sliver of the Old World's memory. The Popol Vuh. And here again, the story begins before the rise of human kings. It begins with creator deities, the maker, modeler, who decide to fashion beings to inhabit the earth. Their purpose is explicit. They required beings who would keep the days, who would speak their names and honor them. The creation of humanity is, once again, presented as a functional requirement of the gods. More chillingly, the Popol Vuh describes several attempts at this creation. The first beings were made of mud, but they were mindless and dissolved in water. The next were carved from wood. They could speak and multiply, but they had no hearts, no minds, and did not remember their creators. They were a failed prototype. This narrative detail resonates with the Mesopotamian concept of humanity as a workforce that grew too noisy, too chaotic. In both accounts, our species is not a final, perfect creation, but an ongoing experiment, a biological technology that proved difficult to calibrate and control. The first models were flawed and had to be decommissioned. And how were these wooden people, this failed iteration of humanity, dealt with? The Popol Vuh is unambiguous. The Creator God sent a great flood to wipe them from the face of the earth. The sky filled with black rain, the waters rose, and the flawed creation was erased to make way for a new attempt, this time using maize. It is the third time we have encountered this specific mechanism in the foundational records of a major civilization. In Sumer, in Egypt, in the Mayan world, the story is the same. A period of direct divine management, the creation of humanity for a specific purpose, and a catastrophic deluge that serves as a worldwide reset button, a clearing of the slate. A silence descends upon the room. On the desk lie the notes, the translations, the maps. Mesopotamia, the Nile Valley, the jungles of the Yucatan. 3 points on a globe, separated by impassable distances and insurmountable gulfs of time. And yet the core of their oldest memory is identical. It is a blueprint, a shared recollection of the world's early operational history. The consistency of this pattern defies all conventional models of historical development. It is a signal that persists through the noise of centuries, a message that has been copied and preserved in the hard drives of 3 unrelated cultures. The researcher can only sit before this evidence, a humble witness to its sheer improbable coherence. The work is slow. The researcher's hands, illuminated by the single lamp, move across a map, connecting these disparate points not with a solid line, but with a tentative, dotted one. The lines represent the pattern, the shared narrative, but the empty spaces between the dots represent the true antagonist of this investigation, the vast, silent abyss of what has been lost. We have these fragments of a global memory, but we do not have the original document. We have the regional translations, but the source code is missing. The perfect, coherent explanation was likely recorded once, but it has long since been ground into dust by the relentless machinery of time. This forces a change in the nature of the inquiry. The question is no longer whether these individual stories are true in a literal sense. The sheer weight of the recurring pattern demands a more sophisticated approach. We are not looking at isolated myths that happen to resemble one another. We are looking at the remnants of a single, coherent system of thought, a unified field theory of our own origins that was once the global standard. The task of the researcher is not to prove it, but to reconstruct the architecture of that forgotten system from the few, scattered blueprints that have survived the wreckage of millennia. The pattern is not merely narrative, it is structural. Each account describes a clear hierarchy. At the top are the ultimate administrators, the architects. Below them are the lesser divinities, the managers and enforcers. And at the bottom is humanity, the workforce, the project. This is not the chaotic, emotional world of the Greek pantheon. This is a corporate structure. It is a system of governance, described with chilling consistency, whether in the ledgers of Sumer, the monumental inscriptions of Egypt, or the sacred books of the Maya. The titles change, the language is different, but the organizational chart remains the same. And so, we must push deeper. If the foundational story is the same, and the hierarchical structure is the same, then what of the infrastructure itself? What of the physical, tangible elements of this administration? The focus must now shift from the grand narrative of kings and gods to the mundane details of their operations. We must look for evidence not just in the king lists and creation myths, but in the records of construction, the star charts, the legal codes. Was there a shared technology, a common system of measurement, a universal set of protocols that govern the management of this terrestrial enterprise? The light in the archive seems to dim further, the shadows deepening around the edges of the room. The initial discovery of a strange inventory list has now spiraled into a global pattern of impossible consistency. The lone researcher, a stand-in for our own quiet curiosity, is now faced with a far more daunting task. They must search for the fingerprints of the architects themselves, not in their stories, but in the very bricks and mortar of the ancient world. The inquiry is turning from history to engineering, from mythology to physics. The silence in the room is no longer just the absence of sound. It is the feeling of standing at the threshold of a much larger and more complex reality. The dust motes that dance in the lamplight seem like tiny distant stars, each one a forgotten record, a lost detail. The scope of the investigation has grown immense, stretching across the entire globe and back to the dawn of human memory. The weight of this emerging pattern is palpable, a pressure in the quiet air. It suggests that the history we have been taught is an incomplete story, a simplified summary that omits the most important chapter, the one that explains how the whole system was set up in the first place. The evidence for that chapter, it seems, has been waiting patiently, filed away in the archives of our world's oldest and most disconnected cultures. The patterns in the records are not random. They are too consistent, too structured across too many centuries to be the product of disparate myths. They point toward a source, a central authority whose operational procedures are reflected in the ledgers of a dozen cities. The focus of the investigation must now shift from the documents themselves to the entities named within them, the figures who sit at the top of the organizational chart. They are referred to by many names, but the Sumerian texts group them under a single collective designation: the Anunnaki. This is not a word that inspires worship in the records. It is a term that denotes a class of beings, a council, a governing body. The scribes list their names and titles with the same administrative sobriety used for a shipment of cedar wood from a foreign land. These figures do not enter the historical record as gods of faith, but as executives of an enterprise. The texts, when read through a lens of function rather than mythology, describe a hierarchical body with clearly delineated roles and responsibilities. They are not forces of nature to be appeased. They are directors of a project to be reported to. Their presence is felt in the establishment of order, the measurement of land, the digging of canals, and the founding of cities. The creation of the world is often described in language that resembles the drafting of a cosmic charter, establishing the parameters and objectives of a new venture. Their authority is absolute, not because they are divine, but because they are the founders and chief operators of the entire system. The hierarchy is palpable and rigidly defined. At its apex sits a figure like Anu, the chairman of the board, whose authority is immense but remote. Below him are the two primary operational managers who seem to oversee the terrestrial project directly. Their names echo through thousands of tablets, their functions always distinct, their responsibilities never overlapping. They are Enlil and Enki. The dynamic between these two figures is not a family squabble between gods. It is the central tension of the entire administrative system. It is the conflict between the need for absolute order and the unpredictable consequences of technological progress. The history of the early world, as recorded by the scribes, is the history of this executive conflict. Enlil is consistently portrayed as the chief administrator, the enforcer of the council's decrees. His domain is the world itself, the land, the air, the territorial boundaries. He is the guardian of order and the ultimate authority on systemic stability. The tablets describe him drawing the borders and assigning the domains. His primary concern is the smooth, predictable functioning of the enterprise. When the system is stressed, when an unforeseen variable threatens its equilibrium, it is Enlil who acts. His decisions are not born of emotion, but of a cold, managerial logic aimed at preserving the integrity of the project. He is the ultimate expression of centralized control, the enforcer of the original blueprint. It is in this context that his most infamous act must be understood. The decision to bring the flood, as detailed in the Atrahasis, is presented as an executive response to a critical system failure. The noise of humanity, its uncontrolled growth and chaotic activity, had breached acceptable operational parameters. It was a flaw in the system, a bug that threatened the stability of the entire platform. Enlil's solution, a total wipe of the defective component, is not the act of a wrathful god punishing sin. It is the chillingly logical, if brutal, decision of a manager decommissioning a failed experiment. The record is a report on a protocol, not a story of divine anger. One must be still with this interpretation. The air in the archive, thick with the scent of old paper and clay, does not offer comfort. To see this figure not as a myth, but as a functionary, is to glimpse a past far colder and more structured than we imagine. The silence here is not empty. It is the echo of a command being given, a decision made in a celestial boardroom that resulted in the reshaping of the entire world. The dust that settles on the tablet is the dust of that former world, a world run according to a logic that saw our entire species as a variable to be managed, or, if necessary, deleted. In direct contrast to Enlil stands his brother, Enki. If Enlil is the guardian of the system's stability, Enki is its master engineer, the head of technology and development. His domain is not the land, but the foundational knowledge upon which civilization is built. The records consistently credit him with the design and creation of the human worker, the Lulu Amelu. He is the geneticist, the craftsman, the one who solves logistical problems with new inventions. He brings the arts of civilization, irrigation, brick-making, writing, not as divine gifts, but as a technology transfer, equipping the workforce with the tools necessary to perform its duties. His actions during the flood narrative are therefore not an expression of humanistic compassion, but of something more complex. When Enlil decrees the destruction of humanity, it is Enki who leaks the information, who provides the blueprints for an ark to a chosen human, Atrahasis or Ziusudra. From a functional perspective, he is not saving a species he loves. He is preserving a valuable asset. He is the project engineer protecting his work from the sweeping, destructive decision of the chief administrator. He is salvaging the core data, ensuring the project is not a total loss, allowing for a future reboot. His is the logic of the inventor, unwilling to see his creation utterly scrapped. The tension between these two figures defines the operational dynamic of the Anunnaki. It is the eternal conflict between the Department of Order and the Department of Innovation. Enlil demands stability and adherence to the original plan. Enki pushes the boundaries, creates new things, and deals with the messy, unpredictable consequences. This is not the stuff of myth. It is the timeless story of any large, complex organization. The Sumerian scribes, in their meticulous records, were not just writing about the gods. They were documenting the fundamental principles of system management as they had been taught them. This specialization extends throughout the entire council. The records show a system of distributed responsibilities, an organizational chart of divine specialists. The goddess Inanna is not a vague deity of love. She is the manager of the communal storehouse, the overseer of the resources that ensure a city's survival. Her temples were not just places of worship, they were the administrative centers of the local economy. The god Ninurta is not a generic warrior. His function is to enforce boundaries and oversee agriculture, ensuring the land is productive and secure. Each entity has a portfolio, a specific set of duties. There is no redundancy, only a clear and efficient division of labor. The language used to describe their actions reinforces this functional interpretation. The texts do not say the gods loved or hated. They say they decreed, assigned, measured, established, and inspected. These are the verbs of governance, engineering, and management. They are the words one would find in a project brief or a series of internal memos. The scribes who recorded these events were not mystics receiving visions. They were clerks taking minutes, documenting the directives that came down from the executive level and shaped the physical and social reality of their world. We are left to contemplate the nature of their presence. The records do not suggest they were ethereal spirits. They describe beings who walked the earth, who founded specific cities in specific locations, and who directly instructed the first human rulers. The pre-Diluvian kings of the Sumerian king list, with their impossibly long reigns, begin to look less like mythical figures and more like a different class of being entirely, perhaps the first generation of local governors or site managers operating on a biological and temporal scale that matched their superiors. They were not human kings as we know them. They were the bridge between the Anunnaki Directorate and the human workforce. Their rule was written not just on clay, but into the landscape itself. The great ziggurats were not just gestures of worship. They were described as literal homes, command centers, links between heaven and earth. The intricate canal systems that made agriculture possible in the arid plains were not human innovations. They were the result of a master plan, a feat of hydrological engineering taught and overseen by the project managers. The very layout of the first cities, their sacred precincts aligned with celestial phenomena, suggests a level of planning and knowledge that was delivered, not discovered. The civilization was the physical artifact of their administration. But here, the invisible antagonist asserts its power. The records are incomplete. We have the ledgers, the king lists, the summaries of major events. But the technical manuals, the detailed reports, the minutes of the council meetings where these decisions were made, these are almost entirely gone. We are like archaeologists who have found the accounting department of a vast, ancient corporation, but the engineering labs and the boardroom have been reduced to dust. The silence from these missing records is profound. It forces us to reconstruct the nature of the enterprise from the cold, hard data of its economic and political consequences. This is the great shift in perspective the evidence demands. We are not reading a collection of creation myths from a primitive people. We are examining the fragmented archives of a global enterprise, a period of planetary management conducted by a group of beings with a different understanding of time, technology, and purpose. Their strangeness is not in their supernatural powers, but in their cold, dispassionate rationality. They were not gods to be worshipped in the modern sense. They were the administration, and humanity, according to the records they left behind, was simply the local labor force. The low light of the archive feels different now. It is no longer just a place of quiet study. It is a room filled with the ghosts of a colossal, forgotten bureaucracy. Every tablet, with its precise wedge-shaped marks, is a piece of paperwork from a system so vast and so ancient that its very memory has been eroded into what we now call myth. The researcher's task is not to believe, but to read the documentation that remains, to see the structure that the scribes so faithfully recorded, and to acknowledge the chillingly coherent, functional, and alien world it describes. The archaeologist's trowel makes a different sound. For meters, it has scraped against the dense, cluttered earth of a settlement mound, a tell in southern Iraq. Each pass revealed the detritus of life. The shard of a storage jar, the bone of a sheep, the dark stain of a long-dead fire pit. But now, the sound is softer, a clean whisper against a different kind of material. The trowel exposes not a floor or a wall, but a uniform band of pale, sterile soil. It is a layer of wind-blown sand and fine silt, laid down with the slow, indifferent patience of nature. It is a line in the earth, as clear and deliberate as the one the scribe drew on his tablet to mark the coming of the flood. Within this layer, there is nothing. No pottery, no tools, no seeds, no impressions of reed matting. The dense, chaotic record of human occupation that lies just centimeters below it simply ceases. Above this sterile band, the record of life begins again, but it is different. The pottery styles have changed. The layout of the buildings is altered. It is as if a new city was built on the ghost of an old one, with a thick, silent blanket of time laid between them. The archaeologist does not need a laboratory to understand this. It is a story told by absence. For a century or two, or perhaps more, this place was empty. The life that had thrived here for generations was gone, leaving only the wind to sweep the dust into a neat archaeological seal. This physical gap, this sterile layer of earth, is the truest manifestation of our invisible antagonist. It is not an act of destruction. A burned layer would tell a story of conquest. It is not a slow decay. A gradual abandonment would look different, a tapering off of activity. This is a caesura, a full stop. It is the earth itself recording a period of silence, a time when no records were kept because no one was there to keep them. The sun baked the empty mud bricks, and the winter rains dissolved them back into the plain. The wind was the only scribe, and its only entry was this layer of clean, featureless soil, a testament to a profound and unexplained interruption in the human project. We retreat from the sun and the dust, back into the controlled twilight of the archive. Here, the same sterile layer exists, but its medium is different. It is not soil, but time. The researcher lays out a series of translated king lists from different cities. They are chronicles of power, meticulously kept. And yet, there are periods where they all go dark. After the reign of a particular king in Ur, the record breaks. For the next 150 years, there are no royal inscriptions, no year names, no economic tablets dated to a ruling monarch. The administrative machine that had been documenting the flow of goods and the passage of time with such obsessive precision simply stops. The hand of the scribe is lifted from the clay. This is not a case of a few missing tablets. It is a systemic silence that falls across the entire region. Cities that had been major centers of trade and administration cease to produce written records. Their names vanish from the ledgers of their neighbors. It is the documentary equivalent of that sterile band of soil. It is a gap in the data so profound that it suggests not just a political collapse, but a collapse of the very system of recording itself. The knowledge of writing, the bureaucratic impulse to list and to count, seems to have been suspended. The world for a time fell out of its own memory, leaving behind a void that historians are forced to label a dark age. The silence is made more profound by what came before it. The periods leading up to these gaps are often characterized by an explosion of data. We have detailed inventories, complex legal codes, vast lists of laborers and their rations. The system appears to be functioning at its peak efficiency. The scribes record the world with a confidence that suggests permanence. And then, nothing. The transition is not gradual. It is a sharp, clean break. When the records resume a century or two later, the world they describe is different. New dynasties are in power, sometimes of foreign origin. The old gods are sometimes renamed, or their functions subtly altered. The continuity has been broken. The system has been reset. One begins to see a pattern in the absences themselves. The collapse of the Akkadian Empire around 2150 BCE is one such void. The historical records become sparse, confused. The administrative structure built by Sargon and his successors, a marvel of centralized control, dissolves. The king lists record a period of chaos, asking with a kind of bureaucratic despair, who was king? Who was not king? It is a moment where the invisible antagonist, erasure, chaos, the loss of order, takes center stage in the official chronicles. The scribes are not just recording history, they are recording the failure of history, the breakdown of the linear, predictable sequence of power that their lists were created to uphold. This was not simply a political event, it felt like a systemic shutdown. Archaeological evidence from this period points to widespread abandonment of agricultural sites, a catastrophic shift in climate, and the collapse of long-distance trade. The very infrastructure that the Anunnaki administration had supposedly established, the canals, the granaries, the ordered cities, failed. The silence in the clay tablets is the sound of that failure. It is the sound of a complex machine grinding to a halt, its operators gone, its maintenance protocols forgotten. The darkness that follows is not just an absence of kings, it is an absence of the system that made kingship possible. We see a similar, though less dramatic, pattern occurring at other key moments in the historical timeline. A major temple is built and meticulously documented for generations, its rituals and inventories recorded in detail. Then, for a century, it produces no new texts. When the records resume, the temple's role in the city has been diminished, its lands reallocated. The break in the documentation signals a fundamental shift in the power structure, a quiet decommissioning of a once vital node in the network. The erasure is not loud or violent. It is a slow, administrative fade, a budget line being zeroed out, a department being silently closed. The silence between these layers of history, both in the soil and on the tablets, is a presence in itself. It is the negative space that gives the remaining text its true shape. It speaks of fragility, of the profound difficulty in maintaining a complex system against the constant pressure of entropy. The world we see in the records is not a steady, linear progression, but a series of brilliant, highly structured experiments, each one separated by a period of silent collapse and forgetting. The gaps are not flaws in our record-keeping. They are the most accurate part of the story. They are the moments when the project was offline. Perhaps this is a moment to mark our own place in the long count, to acknowledge the silence in the room where you are now, the space between the sounds. What chapter of your own history just ended? What new one has not yet begun? Consider recording the time and place of this moment in the comments below. A single, personal entry, a small act of inscription against the great, encroaching silence that swallows all records in the end. It is a small ritual to remind us that we too live between the lines of a history that is still being written and still being erased. The question that arises from these voids is not what happened, but what was lost. Each time the system broke, a body of knowledge must have vanished with it. The scribal schools that preserved the complex cuneiform script, the architectural techniques used to build the ziggurats, the astronomical observations that calibrated the calendar. These were not things that could survive without a stable institutional structure. The Dark Ages were not just periods of political chaos. They were events of mass forgetting. They were moments when a portion of the original operating manual delivered by the founders was permanently deleted from the system. This suggests that the withdrawal of the Anunnaki, if we are to follow the logic of the records, was not a single event, but a long, drawn-out process punctuated by these systemic failures. Perhaps their retreat was not a choice, but a necessity. As they stepped back, The complex systems they had put in place proved too difficult for their human successors to maintain alone. The noise of humanity was not just its population growth, but its inability to manage the intricate machinery of civilization without the direct oversight of its creators. The recurring Dark Ages are the documented evidence of this struggle. We can trace this withdrawal in the language of the texts themselves. In the earliest layers of writing, the gods are active agents. They are physically present, issuing decrees, inspecting canals, and directly appointing the first kings. Their names are attached to the most fundamental aspects of daily life and economic production. They are the senior management, and their presence is felt in every transaction. The scribe records their actions as concrete, observable events, no different from the flooding of the river or the harvesting of the barley. There is no sense of metaphor. This is simply how the world worked. But as we move through time, past the great erasures and the silent centuries, their role in the records begins to change. They become more distant, more abstract. Kings no longer claim to have been appointed in person by Anu or Enlil in the sacred precinct of the temple. Instead, they rule by the will of the gods. The divine presence is removed from the direct chain of command and elevated to a more remote, ideological plane. The gods are no longer the managers of the enterprise. They have become its symbolic patrons. The language shifts from administration to theology. This is a subtle but profound transformation. It marks the moment when humanity begins to interpret the system rather than simply operate it. The memory of the Anunnaki as physical administrators fades, replaced by the concept of gods as objects of worship, beings to be appeased through ritual rather than reported to through ledgers. The ziggurat is no longer a command center, a link to heaven, but becomes a purely symbolic structure, a gesture towards a sky that is now perceived as empty. The functional relationship has been severed, leaving only the cargo cult of religion in its place. The invisible antagonist, then, is not just the decay of clay tablets. It is the decay of memory itself. It is the slow, inevitable process by which a concrete historical reality is eroded into myth. The Great Silence is the sound of that erosion. It is the sound of humanity forgetting that it was once a component in a much larger machine, and beginning to believe that it was the master of its own creation. The story of our ascent is written on top of a great erasure, a forgetting of our own origins as a workforce designed for a purpose we no longer remember. The silence is the scar tissue that covers that original wound of separation. The researcher in the archive holds 2 tablets, one from before a dark age, one from after. The cuneiform is different. The grammar has shifted. The titles of the king have changed. But the most significant difference is the one that is not written. In the older tablet, the god is a recipient of a grain shipment, a line item in a budget. In the newer one, the king offers a prayer to the god, asking for a long life and a prosperous reign. Between these 2 pieces of clay lies a chasm of forgetting, a silent revolution in the relationship between heaven and earth. The administration has been replaced by faith. The project has been abandoned, and its former employees are now trying to run the factory on their own, dimly remembering the departed executives as distant, powerful spirits. The scattered pieces of evidence now rest on the table, brought together under the single focused beam of the archival lamp. We see the administrative ledger that treats a goddess as a line item. We see the king list that records geological time as political history. We see the operational memo that frames a global flood as a noise abatement protocol. And we see the recurring dark ages, the sterile layers of soil and silence that mark the moments when the system went offline. Seen in isolation, each is an anomaly, a historical curiosity. Seen together, they cease to be curiosities. They become the consistent, interlocking components of a single, coherent, and profoundly alien worldview, a blueprint for a world that was not discovered, but engineered. The logic of this system, once grasped, is inescapable. It is the logic of a project, not a creation. It details the establishment of a terrestrial enterprise, the design of a biological workforce to maintain it, and the series of escalating crises that arose when that workforce began to exhibit unforeseen, chaotic properties. The noise of humanity, its rapid expansion and unpredictable behavior, was not a sign of success. It was a critical system failure, a variable that had breached its operational parameters. The flood was not a punishment for sin. It was the most extreme in a series of attempted patches to correct a design flaw that threatened the stability of the entire platform. The records are not myth. They are the collected incident reports of a project gone awry. One must pause here, in the deep silence of this room. The air itself feels ancient, a medium carrying the faint, residual hum of this forgotten order. The researcher, a proxy for our own focused attention, does not move. Their gaze is fixed on the space between the tablets, the place where the connections are made. This is not the work of excavation, but of architecture, the reconstruction of a vast, invisible structure from its few remaining foundation stones. The sheer, cold rationality of the system being revealed is what chills the air. It is a world without sentiment, a cosmos run on the principles of resource management and systemic equilibrium. It is a world in which we were a tool. The withdrawal of the Anunnaki, then, can be seen in a new light. It was not a sudden departure, but a phased strategic retreat. As they stepped back, the complex machinery of civilization they had installed proved too difficult for their human successors to maintain. The recurring Dark Ages are the documented proof of this failure. Each collapse, each period of forgetting, was a consequence of the handover. Humanity was left in charge of a system whose operating manual it no longer possessed, a system it had been built to serve, not to command. Our history since that time has been a long, slow process of attempting to reverse engineer the technology of our own society, rediscovering principles of law, agriculture, and astronomy that the records insist were once delivered as a complete package. This reframes the very concept of civilization. It ceases to be a triumphant linear march of human invention. Instead, it becomes the story of a species grappling with a powerful, inherited, and poorly understood technology. We did not invent the city, the state, or the law from nothing. We inherited the ruins of a previous model, and have spent the last 5,000 years trying to get it to run properly again. The great innovations of our history, the codes of law, the astronomical calendars, the feats of engineering, may not be acts of pure creation, but acts of remembrance, faint echoes of a far more advanced original knowledge that was lost during the systemic collapses that followed the departure of the original administrators. The weight of a single clay tablet in the hand feels different now. It is no longer just a piece of history. It is a fragment of a lost science, a component from a machine of planetary scale. The scribe who pressed these marks into the clay was not a poet. He was a technician, recording a data point. The sum of his data points describes a world so fundamentally different from our own that it resists our categories of myth, religion, and history. It demands a new category, one that accommodates the possibility that our past is far more structured, far more artificial, and far less human than we have ever been taught to believe. The dust on its surface is the dust of a forgotten factory floor. The central tragedy, recorded with such dispassionate precision in the texts, is that our most cherished human qualities were, from the perspective of the original system, the very source of the problem. Our creativity, our ambition, our unpredictability, our capacity for explosive growth, these were not features. They were bugs. The system was designed for a predictable, stable workforce. Humanity, by its very nature, was a disruptive variable. Our ascent was the measure of their failure to control us. The noise we created was the first, faint signal of the world we would eventually build. A world that traded the silent, sterile order of the original design for the chaotic, vibrant, and dangerous freedom we now call our own. And this is where the pattern becomes truly global. The echoes of this same operational history in Egypt and Mesoamerica can no longer be dismissed as coincidence. They are independent verifications of the same sequence of events, recorded by cultures separated by impassable oceans and millennia of time. They are different translations of the same foundational memory, a time when non-human entities managed the planet, a time when humanity was created for a purpose, and a time when a great cataclysm was used to reset a failing experiment. This is not a shared myth. It is the ghost of a shared history, a signal that has been propagating through the noise of human culture for thousands of years, waiting for a moment of quiet in which it could finally be heard. The story these records tell is therefore not about the past. It is about a fundamental principle of systems. With cold, administrative clarity, they lay out a sequence. A highly ordered system creates a complex, adaptive subsystem to serve its needs. The subsystem, through its own internal logic, grows in complexity until it begins to disrupt the functioning of the larger system. The primary system then attempts to contain or eliminate the disruptive subsystem. This is not mythology. It is a timeless law of complex dynamics, a pattern that plays out in ecology, in economics, and in technology. The Sumerian scribes were simply the first to write it down, recording the moment it first played out on a planetary scale. We stand at a threshold of understanding, looking back at a history that now seems less like a story and more like a schematic. The low light of the archive is no longer a comfort. It is a necessity, a way of seeing the faint lines of this ancient blueprint without the glare of our own modern assumptions. We are forced to confront the possibility that the world we inhabit is a second-hand world, a project abandoned by its original architects, a garden left to run wild. The silence in this room is the silence of that abandonment, a quiet that has stretched across the ages, filled only by the growing, chaotic noise of our own endeavors. This line of inquiry, this careful tracing of a pattern that spans the globe and the millennia, does not end here in this quiet room. It extends forward, out of the archive, and into the fabric of our own time. To follow it is not to seek a final, simple answer, but to accept the responsibility of the question itself. It requires a different kind of attention, a patience for the vast and the unresolved. Those who understand this will know that the journey is the purpose, and they will know when it is time to return to the silence, to listen for the next faint echo from the deep past. The true implication, then, is that the experiment never ended. The departure of the Anunnaki was not the conclusion of the project, but the beginning of a new, uncontrolled phase. They did not shut the system down. They simply walked away, leaving it to run on its own chaotic, unpredictable course. What happens to the factory when the workforce takes it over, with only a fragmented and misunderstood memory of the original operating instructions? The answer is the whole of human history. Our wars, our empires, our art, our religions, all of it is the result of that single, momentous decision to let the experiment run wild. We are not the children of gods in a poetic sense. If we are to read the records as they are written, we are the descendants of a systemic flaw that the system itself could not contain. Our civilization is a monument to that flaw. It is the sound of the initial noise, amplified over 200 generations. We are the bug that became the new operating system. Our relentless drive to build, to expand, to connect, to fill every silence with our own data and our own clamor, is the core of our being because it was the core of our initial divergence. We are, in a very real sense, the children of the chaos that broke the old, silent order. The records, then, are more than just a history. They are a case file, a diagnostic report on the nature of our own species. The scribes, in their meticulous, dispassionate work, were not just recording the past. They were documenting a set of initial conditions, describing a fundamental instability that was observed at the very dawn of our existence. They were writing down the physics of our own nature, a nature that was deemed dangerously unpredictable by the very intelligence that designed it. The strangeness of their world is not that it was inhabited by gods, but that it was a world that could not contain us. The final unsettling question, therefore, is not about them. It is about us. The first cities created a noise that was too much for the cosmic order to bear. Today, our global civilization does not create a noise. It creates a roar, a constant planet-wide vibration of data, industry, and communication. Are we simply repeating the same pattern on an infinitely larger scale? Are we approaching another threshold, a point where the complexity we have created once again breaches the fundamental parameters of the system we inhabit? The ancient tablets offer no answers. They only provide a chillingly familiar precedent, a record of what happened the first time the noise became too loud. The researcher's hand moves, and the single lamp is switched off. The tablets, with their impossible data and their cold, coherent logic, are returned to the darkness. The room is now filled with a different kind of silence, one that is no longer empty. It is pregnant with the weight of the pattern, the shape of the implication that has been revealed. The mystery has been transferred. It no longer resides in the ancient clay, resting in its climate-controlled drawer. It now resides in the mind of the one who has seen the connection. It has followed us out of the archive, a silent, looming question that now casts a shadow over the entire modern world. The lamp in the archive is now off. The darkness that fills the room is not an absence of light, but a return to the natural state of these objects. For millennia they rested in the earth, in a silence unbroken by inquiry. Our work tonight was a brief interruption, a fleeting moment of illumination in their long, quiet existence. Now the room is returned to them. The air grows still, settling back into its ancient equilibrium. The faint hum of the climate control is the only sound, a modern machine working to hold back the slow, relentless tide of decay. But it is a temporary measure. The final victory always belongs to the silence and to the dust. The investigation does not end with a conclusion. It simply ceases. The connections have been laid out, the pattern traced from one continent to another, from one millennium to the next. The evidence now rests where it began, in the quiet dark of its drawers and display cases. To ask for a final answer is to misunderstand the nature of the record. The scribes were not writing a story with a beginning and an end. They were recording the operational data of a system in motion. That system did not conclude. It merely changed its state. The administrators withdrew. The noise of humanity began its exponential rise, and the experiment entered a new, unmanaged phase. We are left here, in this suspended moment after the last word has been spoken. The true weight of the inquiry is not in the strangeness of the data, but in the chilling coherence of the system it describes. To have seen the blueprint, however fragmented, is to be permanently altered. The ruins of Eridu and Ur are no longer just the remnants of early cities. They are the decommissioned sites of the first great terrestrial project. The Sumerian king list is no longer a fantastical myth. It is a damaged spreadsheet from a forgotten era of management, its numbers hinting at a temporal physics we can no longer access. The memory, once awakened, cannot be put back to sleep. The presence of the scribe feels closer in this final darkness. We can almost sense the weight of his responsibility, the methodical discipline required to keep the record straight. He was not a poet, free to invent. He was a functionary, bound by the rigid protocols of his office. His hand, pressing the reed into the damp clay, was not expressing a belief. It was documenting a transaction. The coldness of his work is his greatest legacy. He left us not a religion to be believed, but a body of administrative law to be deciphered. A paper trail leading back to a cosmic bureaucracy whose boardroom has long since gone dark. Outside the archive, the museum is a palace of shadows. The great winged bulls of Assyria, the stoic pharaohs of Egypt, the marble gods of Greece, they all stand silent in the gloom. For most, These are the icons of the ancient world. But tonight, they seem like secondary characters, the loud and dramatic kings who inherited the throne after the original founders had already left the stage. The true source code of their civilizations lies not in their monumental art, but in the small, unassuming tablets filed away in the dark, the boring administrative records that outline the initial setup of the entire system. The mind's eye travels outward, away from the city, leaving the museum and its silent collections behind. It moves across the sleeping continents until it rests upon the desert plains of southern Iraq. The moon is a sliver of bone in a sky of infinite black. Below, the low mounds that mark the graves of the first cities are almost invisible, gentle rises in the flat, featureless landscape. A cool wind, the only thing that has truly endured here, whispers over the dust of Uruk. It is a sound without memory, a sound of pure entropy, slowly grinding the last remaining potsherds into even finer sand. This is the final state of all records. Here, in this profound emptiness, the scale of the story becomes tangible. This was the stage. This was the laboratory where the experiment in human civilization was first initiated. The silence that hangs over these ruins is not the gentle quiet of a place that has fallen asleep. It is the deep resonant silence of a machine that has been shut down. The ghosts that linger here are not those of kings or priests, but of engineers and project managers. The wind carries not their voices, but the faint, residual hum of the colossal enterprise they abandoned, a hum that can only be heard when all other noise has ceased. The central question was never about them. It was never about whether the Anunnaki were real, or what their ultimate nature might have been. The records are too fragmented, the silence too deep, to ever provide that kind of certainty. The true question, the one that remains etched into this desolate landscape, is about the pattern they recorded. The pattern of a system creating a subsystem that becomes too complex, too chaotic, too noisy to control. It is a timeless dynamic, a fundamental law of complex systems. The scribes of Sumer were simply the first to document its application to our own species. And so, we are left with the echo. The story of our origins, as written by our oldest ancestors, is the story of a design flaw. Our greatest strengths, our creativity, our ambition, our uncontrollable urge to expand and to build, were, from the perspective of the original, ordered system, the very definition of a bug. The project was not to create a creature that would one day dominate the planet with its own chaotic brilliance. The project was to create a stable, predictable workforce. In that, the records are clear. The project failed. Our existence is the evidence of that failure. The withdrawal, then, was not an ending. It was a concession. It was the moment the administrators realized the disruptive variable they had created could no longer be contained by the original parameters of the system. They did not destroy their creation. They simply stepped away and let it run. The whole of human history, our empires and our philosophies, our arts and our sciences, our endless wars and our fleeting moments of grace, is the result of that decision. We are the children of the noise, the descendants of the chaos that broke the silent, perfect order of the garden. The camera of the mind pulls back, rising from the moonlit desert floor. It ascends until the curve of the earth becomes visible, a fragile blue and white crescent hanging in the void. From this vantage point, the lights of our modern world are a glittering web, a planetary nervous system of pure information and energy. It is a sight of breathtaking beauty and complexity. It is the sound of 7 billion human lives, all contributing to a single global roar that extends from the depths of the oceans to the silence of space. It is a noise that dwarfs the first faint clamor that once disturbed the rest of Enlil. The records left by the scribes are not a prophecy. They are a precedent. They are a single data point from the last time a system of this complexity reached a critical threshold. They offer no guidance, no solution. They simply state what happened. A world built on a specific, fragile order was irrevocably broken by the emergence of a new, chaotic force. The old system fell into silence, and the noise became the world. We have inherited the consequences of that first great disruption, and we have amplified its defining characteristic to a scale the Sumerians could never have imagined. The first rays of dawn begin to touch the high atmosphere, a thin line of impossible blue drawn across the edge of the world. The night is ending. The quiet vigil with the past is over. The work of the archive is to preserve the records, not to interpret them. The work of the curator is to show you where to look, not what to see. The rest is left to the silence that follows, the space you must now inhabit alone, with the weight of the pattern that has been revealed. The question has been transferred. It no longer lives in the clay. It lives in you. And so we leave it here. The story does not resolve. It dissolves back into the vast, undocumented silence from which it came. The final image is not of a tablet, nor of a ruin, but of that single, silent question mark, hanging in the twilight between the ancient past and our own uncertain future. Something has not been explained. Something has been remembered. And the world you return to when this image fades is no longer quite the same, for you can now hear the faint ancient hum of the system beneath the roar of your own time.